I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest military and diplomatic updates from the invasion of Ukraine, and we analyse the rise of Ukraine's maritime drone force that's challenging the Russian fleet in the Black Sea.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 28th of November, day 278, and today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nichols, our senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, and our assistant comment editor Francis Turnley. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, hi everybody. It has been a fairly static weekend. That's partly on account of the terrible weather across Ukraine. It's still very, very wet, which is turning the mud into just a sticky, gloopy, tank swallowing mess. Wheeled vehicles virtually unusable. Movement on foot extremely difficult. We've seen images. There's many images on social media of trenches filling up with water. I mean, it's just awful. That is likely to freeze in the next starting in the next few days. If it's not, it's frozen already in some areas, many areas, but it's likely to be widespread across the whole country in the next few days. It will take some time to freeze, but then that should allow some form of manoeuvre if either side were to be in a position to try it. So try and actually, physically drive across the area and try and have any kind of military effect. But until that happens, we've seen, so over the weekend, Kherson down the south is being hit repeatedly by Russian artillery from across the river. There were 54 strikes on Sunday alone. No casualty figures seen from that, but 10 civilians were killed last Thursday in the city. This is multiple rocket launches, the BM-21 Grad rocket launchers that Russia is using there. In military terms, that would just be called harassment fire. It doesn't actually achieve anything except to just it tries to throw your opponent off balance, basically, and out of to break up any plans they have. I mean, I'm trying not to say it's just nuisance fire, but that effectively what it is on a large scale. It's just there to constantly try and stop you doing whatever you'd like. Try and put any military plans together. It doesn't actually affect anything in a great scheme of things. And in this particular instance, firing it against a city, all it's doing is killing civilians, which is all we've seen from Russia just lately. As President Zelensky said in his nightly address last night, he's bracing the country for more such attacks. Elsewhere, on the Donbass front, it's largely static, except for around the town of Bakhmut, which we know Russia has put a lot of effort into trying to take over recent weeks. They've put the Wagner group, the mercenary group, is there, we think, in some numbers, some low hundreds of numbers, we believe. We think that the Wagner group there has been reinforced with recently mobilized Russian soldiers and some of the troops that are coming out of Kherson. Ukraine, again, there's reasonably credible reporting that Ukraine... not reasonably. This is from the New York Times. So, credible reporting from the New York Times saying that Ukraine has been reinforcing the area with special forces and territorial defence fighters, so the kind of local defence fighters. So not your sort of Premier League infantry, but still good fighters fighting for their local areas. They're very highly motivated. So there's a big fight around Bakhmut at the moment. We thought that was going to happen. We thought when it was assessed that up to half of the Russian soldiers that got across the river from Kherson were going to be redeployed. We thought they were going to go up into the Donbass to try and shore up that increasingly pressurised front there. They'd hope to try and make some advances, but there doesn't seem to be any sign of that. I think the most they can do is very, very local. I mean, a few hundred metres, if that, per week, and there's no real evidence of that happening in any widespread manner. So this seems to be fitting in with the pattern that we've seen. However, pressing against that point, Ukraine are reinforcing their area there with special forces. Just separately, there was a really interesting. There's a few other bits and pieces of the news, but I just want to draw your attention to a good thread on Twitter by Jack Watling, who's one of the land warfare specialists at RUSI, and not just land warfare clearly, but he speaks very he's hugely informed on this, and in turn he informs others up to and including governments. I believe, I don't know for a fact, but that's my suspicion. And he's just talking about what winter war is, making some logical deductions, but very sensible deductions from what we know and what we observe. And he's basically saying things like, we've seen how drones have become used, and the innovation around drones in this since February the 24th. So the obvious factor is that in winter there's very little foliage because all the leaves drop off the trees, so you are much more visible at the ground level. So that means you've got to stay low where it's wet and cold and muddy and yucky. So it really comes down to the personal administration of the individual soldiers and units, or small scale units, platoon companies, and even battalions, really, but very low level warfare. Separating dry and wet kit and this kind of thing, making sure you're sleeping well and sleeping dry, making sure you're getting food. Now, we know Ukraine have been fighting for years through many winters in the Donbass, holding the line there. Not quite the same for Russia. Obviously, it was the Luhansk and Donetsk so-called People's Republics who are holding the line there. So the Russian troops that are there have not fought through any great winters in this campaign. And of course, they've been largely worn down. So there's many more mobilized people there that are going to suffer. We know their kit and their training is not as it should be. So they are. Jack makes the point that these guys are going to tend to huddle together in large groups, which can then be targeted. Then there's not going to be much offensive spirit. So keeping these guys going, keeping them alive, and in any kind of defensive posture is going to be a real effort. Trying to expect any sort of offensive spirit from them is just, I think, probably beyond what they're capable of. And Jack is suggesting that what Ukraine should concentrate on over the winter is skirmishing, just small-scale raids to keep Russians in position, to stop them coming back out of the line, to rest, recover, dry out, etc., to keep them fighting in position, prevent the rotation of any units, so you get better equipped, better trained, more motivated units in there. And he also makes the point about how until the ground freezes, properly hardens, then any logistics are going to be very much fixed to roads, which again are known, targetable, and you can plan on that. So just some very interesting deductions that Jack Watling makes there about winter war. Well worth a read on Twitter. A few other bits and pieces to go, but I'll just take a little breather.
Thanks very much for that, Dom. Francis, can I go to you? There's an awful lot, as Dom said, that's going on.
Thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone. The lines may have been static, but certainly in many other areas of this conflict, it hasn't been over the weekend. And I'll start with an example, if any further examples were needed, of how this war is having much broader ramifications than just those that we're seeing in Ukraine itself. It's a story of Putin's energy weapon. That's how it's been dubbed by The Economist, which is effectively his strategy on denying Europe energy, oil, gas, and the consequences of that. Now, of course, we've talked about those consequences many times in recent months, but when you actually crunch the numbers, which is what The Economist have done, it's quite shocking reading. So they've modelled that there will be as many, if not more, people who will die as a consequence of the energy war than of those who've actually already been killed in the battlefield of Ukraine itself. So we've talked about in the past, the estimated battlefield deaths in the war are around 60,000, up to 30,000 for Russia, 30,000 for Ukraine. I think those numbers are low. I think they're low for the Russian losses, but regardless, we know those are the minimum. And the Economist modelling has said that the effect of soaring electricity prices on deaths during the winter believe that the current cost of energy will likely lead to an extra 147,000 deaths if this is a typical winter in Europe. If it's a particularly harsh winter, then that could rise to 185,000. But even if it's just a mild winter, it would still be 79,000. So very, very high numbers indeed. Some countries are more severely affected than others. In Italy, which has an older population, of course, and particularly high electricity prices, it's expected that they would suffer the most extra deaths. Also in Estonia and Finland, it would be expected there would be extra deaths as well than expected. Things are expected to be less severe in Britain and France, which have introduced price caps, and also in Austria. But it's not a good picture. However you crunch these numbers, there is increased deaths as a consequence of this energy front. And so I think when you see it in those terms, you can see why there's been so much concern about this. So these are the kind of numbers that no doubt have been being talked about behind closed doors in Whitehall and other government administrations for some time. So you can see why this has been a particular concern. But, and I think it's important to end with something a little bit more positive, the energy front is expected to not be as severe as was feared when it all began back in February, and obviously the energy consequences became apparent around the March-April time. There is now expectation that the market has adapted more, that prices will be lower, and the consequences that there will be fewer people who will, freeze or go cold in their homes. So that is a positive, but nonetheless, even with that, you can see the consequences of this when you actually extrapolate that across the continent. Just staying on the energy theme very briefly, I've talked a lot about Zaporizhzhia recently, and just an important update, I think, on this, because there was a little bit of speculation over the weekend that the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia had been abandoned by the Russians, or was about to be abandoned by the Russians, but this has been vehemently denied by the Russian administration, who are in control of the Eritrea. They're saying that the media are actively spreading fakes that Russia is allegedly planning to withdraw and leave the plant. This information is not true. So as far as we know, Zaporizhzhia is still under the control of the Russians, but a lot of speculation over the weekend, so I thought it was important for you just to clarify that.
Thanks, Francis. We'll come back to Dom just quickly and then back to you before we bring in Roland. So, Dom, you said you've got a few more things to talk us through. What else is there? What have you been looking at?
Yeah, so quickly, Belarus, Foreign Minister of Belarus, Vladimir Makai, he was killed over the weekend, suspected poisoning, suspected assassination. This is all suspected. None of this is confirmed. This is considered speculation from looking at a number of sources, but it is suggested that this guy, who was President Lukashenko's confidant, very close ally of Belarus President Lukashenko, there were suggestions that he had been under Lukashenko's direction. He'd been charged with negotiating with the US and European countries to soften their positions towards Belarus. So whilst on the one hand, Lukashenko would be saying all the right things to Putin and Russia, and he's hosting Russian, allowing, if he had a choice, allowing Russian soldiers and military units to be on Belarusian soil, Russian Air Force to fly from Belarus, missiles to be fired from Belarus. Actually, as we've long suggested on the pod, we think Lukashenko, as many others have speculated, he's pretty lukewarm about all this. And now there's this suggestion that the foreign minister was actually behind the scenes, reaching out to the West, basically to external partners, trying to explain their position and trying to seek a softening towards Belarus. Anyway, he was. It's not confirmed yet, but almost certainly been killed, and the suspicion was poisoning. There are reports that Lukashenko has ordered his cooks and servants and guards to all be replaced after the sudden death of this guy. So it looks like, and it's being interpreted as a message from Russia, from Putin, to Lukashenko to say, look, get back in line. Don't be going off doing your own, cutting your own deals. You're part of this. So one to watch there. And secondly, 10 days ago, from the Vatican, Pope Francis said that the Vatican was ready to do anything possible to mediate the conflict, put an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine. This is in an interview with the La Stampa, an Italian daily newspaper there. However, the Kremlin has said today, has said that they'd love it. They'd love the the Vatican to mediate, but those pesky Ukrainians again. It's Ukraine's stance that prevents this. And whilst the Vatican might offer to be a negotiating platform, Kyiv's position has made this impossible. I mean, we know this is all part of the game. Obviously, we know that it's not going well on the battlefield at all. All that Russia's got at the moment is the energy terror war against Ukrainian civilians. So they're doing whatever they can. All this talk of negotiation is probably in one of those, even a stop clock tells the correct time twice a day. Actually, they're probably telling the truth. Russia right now would love negotiations. They would love the lines to be literally and figuratively frozen where they are, so that they can see through the winter, try and build up their forces to go again in the spring. Of course, they want negotiations. Of course, they want Ukraine to stop pushing them back. So they've leapt on this suggestion from the Vatican and saying that they're up for mediations. It's just those pesky Ukrainians that keeping the fighting going. I mean, you know my opinion. I've said this before. It is not in Ukraine's best interest right now, I don't think, to stop and try and enter negotiations. They have the battlefield advantages. They need to keep going. The time for negotiation is when is many months down the line. I would suggest when they're in a much stronger position. They're already in a strong position, Kyiv, I would suggest, but they need to be in a much stronger position. And it would suit Russia right now for everything to stop and for negotiations to take place. So interesting there that interesting but not surprising that the Kremlin are welcoming this overture from the Vatican and saying it's only those pesky Ukrainians that still want to keep fighting.
Thanks, Tom. Just a couple more things I think we should cover before we go to Roland and his piece on Ukraine's marine drone warfare. Francis, there's been some criticism for the German government for failing to act fast enough to bolster its army. Can you talk us through this story? It's quite an interesting one.
Well, yes, of course, Germany's been a key focus for us ever since the war began. Very, very prominent partner in all of this, of what's going on in the European Union at the moment, has been quite heavily criticised over the course of the war for being too hesitant to provide military support early on. And some have said that it's now backtracking on some of the commitments that it made back at the beginning of the war. Regular listeners who've been with us since the beginning will recall that Olaf Scholz made a really big pledge that he would be funding considerably more towards the armed forces. I think a further 100 billion was what he offered. And as you say, David, there's been quite considerable criticism over the weekend from within Germany itself for failing to act fast enough to bolster its army following these announcements that happened after the launch of the war. And indeed, some politicians in Germany have actually called on or have remarked that Olaf Scholz is breaking his promises made to the country's soldiers nearly a year ago. So, as I say, 3 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, there was further pledges, about £86 billion worth in extra spending on the Bundeswehr. It declared the start of a new era in which Germany would do everything it takes to defend NATO's borders. Yet critics are saying that 9 months later, not a cent of that money has yet been spent, leaving the army less capable of fighting a war than it was before the invasion. I say that's the argument. One prominent politician who's waded in on this, who's done an interview with us, is the deputy head of the Conservative CDU in the Bundestag. And I'll quote from them directly: "The defense ministry is still working like a German bureaucracy in terms of deepest peace, but it needs to be put on a war footing." Goes on, "Munitions should have been bought by the summer at the latest. We are now at our limit in terms of meeting our NATO obligations. Munitions could have been ordered a long time ago. I've been told by arms companies that they offered munitions, but the government simply didn't order." So, as I say, David, quite an interesting story this in the context of all of the complicated discussions happening behind closed doors about Germany's role. I spoke about that in detail at the end of the podcast last week, so I would listen to that if people want to go into a little bit more detail as to the sort of cultural and political tensions within the country as to why some believe that Germany has this rather unusual stance or strange stance with regard to the war when it's actually in a very, very prominent position in order to be able to assist. And just one other story in the political role, if I may, and I know that Don will have some thoughts on this later on as well, but UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is vowing to maintain military aid to Ukraine in a speech this afternoon. He's going to promise to increase aid to Ukraine next year and to confront international competitors not with grand rhetoric, but with robust pragmatism. I mean, I think that's a quintessential Rishi Sunak trait, as he sees himself very much, I think, as an effective administrator, a sort of technocrat as opposed to an ideologue, in contrast to his predecessor, Liz Truss. Indeed, of course, as I've spoken about at length on the podcast in the past, Rishi Sunak is often seen as being rather less hawkish than Liz Truss on Ukraine, but actually he has been more robust, I think, than many people expected. He's made some very, very strong remarks indeed. Listeners will recall that he was meant to be having a meeting with President Xi at the Bali summit of the G20 last week, but actually that did not go ahead in the end, we believe, because China, were angry with some of the remarks that he had made. London has also banned Chinese-made security cameras from sensitive government buildings as well. This has been an ongoing theme under Rishi Sunak. He's very sceptical of Chinese investment in Britain. And so there's been a bit of a backpedaling on British foreign policy with regard to China in recent months as a consequence of what's been going on in the war. But I'll just read one more quote from him and then we can go over to Roland. So he says, "Under my leadership, we won't choose the status quo. We will do things differently." And I should say that this is Rishi Sunak's first major foreign policy speech. So I think we can expect a few more goodies, if that's the right way of phrasing it, in the speech later on.
Well, thank you very much for that, Francis. Roland Oliphant, can we go to you? You've written an absolutely fascinating piece for The Telegraph. It's on the website. For people listening, you can go to read it. It's called "How Ukraine's Drone Navy is Outsmarting Russia's Superior Black Sea Forces." Roland, kind of difficult to know where to begin with this. So can we ask you, first of all, why did you decide to write about this? What interested you about this story?
I wrote about it because my editor told me to be absolutely frank. I'm not really a sea salty kind of man, but there's been a lot of, it's one of these funny little weapon systems, one of these many things that pop up in the war that make people sit up and pay attention and go, hold on, what's going on there? We haven't seen this before, have an explanation. So we thought, kind of, why not have a look at these funny little boats that have kind of become quite prominent over the past month, basically.
And what did you find? I mean, you came to this as a non-specialist. So what's the story you've ended up telling?
Okay, so to put it in historical context, the historical context being the past month or so, kind of about a month or so ago, this strange black thing that looked like a speedboat without a seat in it washed up on the headland just to the west of Sevastopol in Crimea. The Russians found it was clearly a kind of remote-controlled boat, which the Russians assumed was being operated by the Ukrainians. They put out photographs of it, and then they detonated it because it was found to be carrying an explosive device. They had to get rid of it. And then things were quiet for a couple of weeks. And then about 2 weeks after that, October 29th, I think, suddenly there are a series of massive explosions in Sevastopol harbor overhead. And it turned out about 6 or 7, we're not quite sure on the numbers, of these little things had attacked shipping outside. And we think, this is the important thing actually, 2 of them we think got into Sevastopol harbor. We think they damaged at least 2 boats. One is a minesweeper, the other is a frigate called the Admiral Makarov. I think the Russians acknowledged some damage to a bit of port infrastructure as well. They said it was minimal. So that really made people sit up and take notice. And then 18th of November, there was another mysterious blast in Novorossiysk, which is Russia's other big port on the Black Sea, and that is over in Russia proper, in Krasnoyarsk region, which should have been well out of range of anything the Ukrainians could do. And the speculation is, once again, the Ukrainians managed to get one of these radio-controlled speedboats carrying a bomb into that harbor. And this is it's interesting for a couple of reasons. Just in the context of this war, of course, Russia went into this war as the absolute naval supremo, indisputed control of the Black Sea. Ukraine didn't have anything that could really contest Russia's control. They had a few Ukraine lost most of its navy during the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Even those boats it lost then were not in great condition. It did try to build up these little fast gunboats as a kind of alternative. Most of them were lost when Russia took the Azov Sea around Mariupol and Berdyansk early in the war. So Ukraine's really been on the back foot, was meant to be on the back foot in the naval war, but they keep on pulling out these little surprises. They managed to sink the Moskva early in the war with a missile strike, and now they found this other workaround, these little things which are suddenly making things very, very scary for the Russians.
Roland, do we have any sense of how these drone boats, I don't know quite what you want to call them, let's call them these maritime drones, do we have a sense of how they actually work? What's on them? How do you direct them?
I'll do that before we get into that, because I did have these comments from naval types about the nomenclature, the what we should call them. So military types don't like saying drone, because they think it suggests that there is no human in the kill chain anywhere, and that you're talking about autonomous killer robots from Terminator. They like to say unmanned surface vehicle. Although I did speak to a retired Royal Navy commander who said, no one cares, call it a drone. But that is what the professional military types like to say, unmanned surface vehicle. To you and me, it's a radio controlled drone, a boat that goes on water. How do they work? Some things are a mystery. So there's a very good independent naval analyst called H.I. Sutton. You can look up his blog. I spoke to him for this piece. Really informative guy. So he went through the images. The Russians released images. The Ukrainians released of their remarkable kind of daring strike on Sevastopol with the machine gun rounds, kind of sending up plumes of sea as they drive this thing towards the grey hulk of a battleship on the horizon. He thinks that the propulsion system is a commercially built kind of water jet from a jet ski by a Canadian company called Sea-Doo, I think it is. So this is a top of the range kind of jet ski, right? You'd have to be quite a rich kind of jet ski dude to get into these. I'm not a kind of jet ski kind of man, but these are things that are available on the commercial market. Could easily have been bought. I don't know. How do you buy a jet ski on mail order in a jet ski shop? So adaptation of pure civilian technology for the propulsion. They've got a little kind of tower about towards the stern, which we think is a radio control link. It might be Starlink. We don't know. I mean, we know the Ukrainian military has made extensive use of Starlink on land. It might make sense to use Starlink as the internet communications to make these things run. But we don't have confirmation of that. Then further forward, you've got a little tower with a camera on it, which feeds a live feed back to the operator on shore. And then in the main hull, you've got an explosive charge. We're not sure quite how big that is. Given that we don't think they did manage to sink any of these ships, probably not that big. And on the prow, right on the point of the boat, two detonators, which look like they're just ordinary detonators from airdropped Soviet-designed aerial bombs, basically. So quite simple. And the way it seems to work is they're put to sea, they're guided remotely. They try and get as close as possible under cover of darkness, very low in the water, very difficult to detect by radar. And then they drive as quickly as they can, in as many numbers as they can muster, to overwhelm the defenses towards the target.
And do you have a sense of what the Russians are doing to try and counter this? How have they evolved their defensive tactics or their fortifications or whatever? The Ukrainians have clearly got one foot in front in this arms race on the sea. How are the Russians trying to counter them?
Well, the Russians changed their their defensive procedures at Sevastopol and Novorossiysk quite quickly after this. So Sevastopol harbour, it's basically a fjord. It's a very long, narrow, rocky inlet, and the city of Sevastopol is built around this. And off that inlet are other inlets. If you've been to Istanbul and the Golden Horn, it looks a bit like that. So there is a boom across that narrow harbour entrance, which theoretically these things shouldn't have been able to get across. So they've changed their procedure there. They're making it, being much more careful about how often they open that, when they close it. When ships are put to sea, they have to have small craft protection. So there's a screen to prevent these things from coming in. Interestingly, in the footage that we saw that the Ukrainians released of this attack on Sevastopol, you could see a helicopter circling that was clearly trying to target these drones as they were coming in. Now, I spoke to a former Royal Navy captain who's taken part in he was involved in a lot of exercises, kind of working out what to do if you face this kind of attack. And he did talk a lot about having helicopters up there because they've got to see them coming. So the Russians obviously trying to do the same thing. But the kind of important point there, I think, is this captain said to me, look, the problem with this is that you've really got to be on top of your game, right? You've got to be very highly trained for it. And you need intelligence, you need air cover to know they're coming, and then you need really, really modern kind of automated weapons which are able to fix onto multiple moving targets in very short succession to defeat threats like this. And we know that the Royal Navy and the US Navy have been thinking about this for a long time, because we think that Iran has got a lot of these things and has been building up a stockpile of them to use in the event of a great big, if there is a showdown in the Gulf. We think that's what Iran would try to do. The Royal Navy and the United States Navy have been training for this for a long time. We don't think the Russians have been. This is a new thing for the Russians, and they're going to have a very, very steep learning curve to try and find a way to cope with this new threat. But it's a very, very difficult threat. Naval professionals are quite clear about this. This is a real issue for surface navies around the world, and will be in future.
Thank you very much for that, Roland. Dom, can I bring you in here? You've been listening to all of this, and you're a sort of resident military type, I think. What are your thoughts and comments on this?
Resident military type. We'll be having words later, David. Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. We need to just take a little pause, because there's been a lot of chat, certainly since these drones were first seen, uncrewed surface vessels, whatever you want to call them, these boats were seen. A lot of people saying, this is a new model of warfare. This is the future. This is how it's going to be from now on. We've got to be really careful about making these kind of claims. Firstly, because we don't know how good they are. And secondly, it's not new. You can go back to fire ships if you want to. You can go back to some of the activities in the Second World War. This sort of stuff is not new. This tactic is not new. Now, I will be convinced that it is a new model of warfare when I see the effect. And the effect is sinking ships, basically. On the one hand, they already have had an effect. They've penned in the Russian Black Sea Fleet into Sevastopol and elsewhere. They have forced those ships that did go out into the Black Sea to be escorted by fast speedboats. Effectively, the fast inshore attack craft is the military term. If I'm allowed to use military terms, fast inshore attack craft that basically escorting these boats with heavy machine guns on to shoot these drones. So it's caused the Russians to change tactics, but hey, that's warfare. That's what happens. The enemy come up with something, you come up with something to counter it. That's the cat and mouse of warfare. So I'm yet to be convinced so far that this is a new model of warfare. Then the drone itself. Roland talks about the footage that's still out there. You can easily find it on social media of the Russian helicopters, Mi-8 or 17. I can't remember which one. Can't really see the tail raise to tell which one it is. Sorry, getting a bit wonkish again. But there's a Russian helicopter shooting at this thing and missing. Hence it goes in. But equally, we don't know how many they launched and whether or not that helicopter shot 5 of the 6 that went in, or 10 of the 20, or however many. So we don't know how effective it was. But equally, until these drones have some kind of protection themselves that can shoot down helicopters, there's nothing to stop that helicopter going hovering a few feet away and just blasting it from 10 feet. So because they didn't know what it was, this helicopter was flying around. It didn't come very close, and even though the rounds you could see landing were fairly close, and like I say, maybe they sunk some of the other drones that went in, we don't know. But there's no need for that helicopter to hold off, so they're probably unlikely to make that mistake again. So I come back to, what is the effect of this tactic? And until I see much more than penning or forcing the Russians to change their tactics, until I see much more than that, i.e. until I see boats being sunk and ships being sunk, then I refuse to believe that this is a new form of warfare. Now, what it might do, it might have its moment coming up in the next few days, because there's a report this morning from the Ukrainian military saying that they suspect that a Russian ship has gone to sea in the Black Sea Fleet, capable of firing cruise missiles as part of the latest wave. They're expecting another wave of attacks on the energy grid. Natalia Gamenyuk, a spokeswoman for the Ukrainian military, said that the ship's gone to sea and it's going to be armed with Caliber cruise missiles, and it's going to be firing them. Now then, here's your moment then, little drones. If you can have an effect on that ship, if you can either force it not to get to go anywhere within range of Caliber cruise missiles, or such that your Caliber cruise missiles are effective, Russia, or even better still, you sink that boat, then I will believe that this is a new form of warfare. So I think we're about to see whether or not this is more than it's not a story dreamt up. Clearly, it did happen, but we all got very excited. We hadn't really seen this sort of thing before. Images on social media, we all go whizzing off, going, "Ooh, this is amazing! Look at these new things." We've just got to be really, really careful about heralding a new age of military technology. It's all down to the effect, and that's the grassy knoll I will live and die on.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dom. Roland, is there anything more from you that we haven't spoken about your report here?
I think to be fair to the naval analysts, I'm gonna have to push back on behalf of the people I spoke to right there. So I mean, the people who follow this stuff tend to say, look, that is a big effect, right? That's a strategic level effect. They haven't sunk any ships as far as we know. Perhaps the charge isn't that big, but pushing the Russians, the surface fleet, back into port is a big thing. Yes, apparently they put another ship to sea today. Yes, that's a test for them. We don't know how many more the Ukrainians have, but this is different, partly because it's such low risk, right? That these things cost, we think, about $250,000. That's a lot of money to me or you. But if you can get one of those through a screen of small boats, and you can, significantly damage a capital ship, then that's worth it. But also your political risks are very low. Your human, you don't risk losing people. You can basically shoot these off without thinking about it. And the point, I think the point people were trying to make to me, who thought that this was an important point in naval warfare, was, look, this has been coming for a long time. So okay, yes, Francis Drake can fire ships, and yes, people have had radio-controlled boats for, it's not the first time. But actually, everyone was expecting a moment when this became a thing in naval warfare, the same way it's become a thing in the kind of, aerial warfare and the land war. And everyone expected that moment to come in the Persian Gulf, which is why the Royal Navy and the United States Navy have been training like crazy for this anticipated day when they thought their ships in the Gulf were going to be facing dozens and dozens of these things launched by Iran, and we're really going to have trouble holding them off. Now, the Ukrainians have shown it was not a decisive effect. Maybe we could go back, we like our historical analogies. So let's say, tanks on the Somme, big dramatic arrival. They weren't really ready. They'd been rushed into action. Didn't change the course of that war, but it did eventually. The tank is the tank. Once these things become universal and ubiquitous, they're not going to replace capital ships, because those are extremely complex things, and you want people. You don't just want to have unmanned floating hulks floating around the sea. But naval warfare has been moving towards this moment for a long time, and there are implications of the moment arriving, and what it's going to mean for example, for the Taiwan Strait. especially for a navy that's trying to counter trying to counter a much superior foe. Essentially, this is a weapon that plays to the weaker, more asymmetric warfare. It plays to the weaker side. It's something they can use to contest the high seas. I mean, apart from that, I take Dom's point. They haven't sunk anything. They haven't launched that many of them. And the other thing, of course, is that this is largely a land war. Right, this is not a war that's likely to be decided at sea, so it's almost peripheral to the central battle. But nonetheless, I'm taking issue largely because I also began some interviews saying, now look, Francis Drake had fire ships, and I was firmly put in my place. So that's my piece on why this absolutely is a turning point in naval warfare, or not, or maybe just an inflection point in the gradual evolution. I think you can look at these things in either way.
Thanks, Roland. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it, that this has been done by a country which didn't have much of a navy beforehand. This isn't the Royal Navy or the American Navy doing this. And so if you're right that this is a sort of tanks on the Somme moment, I mean, it's worth just dwelling on that for a second, that it's the country that, as you said, lost its ships in the annexation of Crimea and is now thought seriously about how to combat vastly superior forces on paper, and has come up with this. Dom, I know you want to come back on some of this. What would you like to add?
Well, I will allow you an inflection point, Roland. I will wait to see whether or not it's a new model of warfare, and I'll just take you back to October 2000, the attack on the USS Cole at alongside in Aden, refueling in Aden. Al Qaeda attacked it with a suicide-driven fast rigid inflatable boat. Killed 17, wounded 37. Okay, so 17 US sailors killed there, nearly 40 injured. That was effectively what we're talking about here. Less the autonomy, less the not having the suicide element of it. Now that is a great leap. If you can get the autonomy to work, so it is an autonomous vehicle, it's a drone, for the reasons I mentioned before, that if these things are just stooging along, then they are very vulnerable from the air if you can see them, and if you're good at sniping and all the rest of it. So yeah, I am willing to concede that it is a possible inflection point, but. And of course, you can't cover everything all the time. That's not how the military works. So I'm not going to say, well, hey, look, if there's this cruise missile destroyer has gone out to, or frigate has gone out into the Black Sea Fleet, then these things have failed because it's got out. Obviously, they can't. It's not like a net. They don't just stop anything going out. So I'm not saying that they should have stopped it. What I'm saying is, if the Ukrainian military know that this thing is there in the Black Sea, such that they're able to brief it out to journalists, they must have known hours, if not days ago, that it was about to set to sea. If they don't have some means of countering it, then this was a moment in time. And to get wonkish for a moment, this might be a demonstration of kit, not capability. Capability is when you've got it in, you've got many of these things, you've got the infrastructure, the training, you've got the money in line to buy more of them, you've got the people who are working on the next version of it, etc., etc., etc. If you've just got one of these things, or just one group of a number of a number of these drones, then that's just kit. It's a one-shot wonder, which might demonstrate the future, but it is not the future. So I'm yet to be convinced, but I want to be convinced. I want to see this guided missile destroyer, whatever it is, that's apparently going to fire these caliber cruise missiles. I want to see it held off or sunk by these things, and then I will be convinced.
Well, thank you very much, Roland and Dom, for all of that. That was absolutely fascinating. If you've got questions for us, please do remember to message. It's more than welcome. We take what you say and think about it and use it often to think about how we should approach stories in the coming weeks and the coming days. Francis Durnley, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that and some final updates for us before we go to your final thoughts.
Well, thanks, David. Yes, I thought I'd best leave Dom and Roland to it as they got into all of the details, although I would absolutely echo the notion that innovations that are usually made in one war aren't really seen until the war that follows. And so that's why you always have this really profound disconnect in the annals of warfare between the weaponry and the military tactics. So if you say, look at the American Civil War, they're fighting with far more advanced weapons that are made over the course of the war than the tactics that are still Napoleonic ironic. Then if you look at the First World War, then you see that they're fighting in trenches, but they're fighting with technology that again is far more advanced than the military strategy, and thereby that's why you have such enormously high casualty rates like you see at the Somme. But then, as I say, as Roland was saying, the tanks were innovated in that war, but they didn't really have their profound impact and reach their full potential, if that's the right way of thinking about it, in the Second World War. Then you see the atomic bomb developed in the Second World War. We don't really see the influence of that in the most profound sense until the Cold War, which of course defined that whole era. And as they were saying, perhaps, the drone warfare that we've seen in Ukraine, the real ramifications of that we will not see until another future. So it's a very interesting subject, and one that no doubt we'll get into again. Just whilst we're on the naval theme, I just wanted to flag one story that will be familiar to those who will think all the way back to the war, which is Snake Island. So regular listeners will recall that Snake Island was a very significant symbolic site early on in the war because of a group of soldiers who told the Russian warship, the Moskva, to go bleep itself. I better not swear on air. And it was believed at the time that they were killed, that this was their sort of departing message before they were struck. But actually, we discovered later that they were alive and they were captured by the Russians, and some of them have now been freed over the course of the weekend. 12 of them, including some people from Snake Island, some people from the Chernobyl power plant, some people from Mariupol, and we're expecting there to be some quite interesting interviews conducted with them in due course. But an interesting story that's just following up on, of course, a very significant moment in the naval blockade, which was, as I say, the sinking of the Moskva, and that moment which really summarised, I think, the attitude that the Ukrainians had towards the invasion, which was to really act in the most strong and heroic terms, despite the incredible odds that they faced, and hence why this incident of the Moskva being told to go bleep itself was now on stamps in Ukraine and is used in posters and all sorts. It's a really emotive subject. So there's that, and then just one final topic, which is a very depressing one in which to end, really, but I think it's really important that we do so. I've been talking a lot about war crimes recently. And there's a summit today, a major international conference for preventing sexual violence in conflict. And there are dozens of survivors from around the world who will be speaking about their abuse. But of course, many eyes are on Ukraine. I've spoken already about the UN last week and documents that they've released into the researches that are currently being conducted into war crimes and some of the legal avenues that are being pursued in an attempt to bring perpetrators of these crimes to justice. We published a piece over the weekend by James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, who wrote exclusively for the paper about what he sees the significance of the conference. They were bringing over more than 50 ministers from around the world as part of this. He's going to describe about and give a speech himself, talking about how chilling the nature of these reports are, and also as well it's very, very hard to read, I should say, but we have a piece in the paper by Harriet Barber, who we're hoping to get on the podcast this week to talk about it in more detail, who's been interviewing some of the people who are going to be speaking at the conference about what they've experienced in Ukraine. And there are victims who are ranging from the age of 4 to over 80 years old. And as I say, I won't read some of the accounts. They're absolutely sickening. But I would point people who are interested in this area of legal avenues and of war crimes to read Harriet Barber's piece, because it's very, very striking. And just on the same subject, there's been quite an interesting intervention as well over the weekend in an interview with The Telegraph by very important lawyer, Professor Sir Geoffrey Nice, KC. He was the lead prosecutor against Slobodan Milosevic, former president of Serbia, of course, and famously was tried at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia between 1998 and 2006, the crimes that were perpetrated there. And he has said that he believes it's Ukraine that should take responsibility for any legal action against Russia, because the West could, quote, corrupt the process for cheap gas and oil. And as I say in the interview, he talks about his concerns that there are real risks of subtracting out any legal action to the international community, saying that it could end up with Crimea and the Donbass being sacrificed for a peace deal in exchange exchange for energy benefits. And so seeking to put the onus of the prosecution very much in the Ukrainian camp, as opposed to it being something that is internationally organised. So quite an interesting contrast to what, of course, we saw at The Hague with regards to Yugoslavia. So, as I say, an interesting piece that's in this space. But I'd recommend that listeners read both pieces because they're very, very interesting on this subject.
Thank you very much, Francis. And just for our listeners, it's important to say we'll hopefully hear from Harriet Barber and Danielle Sheridan, who've been reporting on this conference this week. So we will have more on this in the days to come. So Roland and Dom, can I just have your final thoughts, please?
Yeah, well, my final thought would be keep an eye on Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's speech later today, where, as Francis said earlier, he's expected to give a very full-throated commitment to Ukraine. I think this is necessary because it's been good up to now that the external support, I don't like to use the phrase Western because there's many other countries that don't sort of come under the nomenclature of West, but it's a bit clunky. But anyway, external support to Ukraine, good in terms of weapons, good in terms of sanctions, but that long-term thing, that credible promise for long-term support to Ukraine is very, very difficult to get over. And Putin will be sitting there thinking, yeah, fine, I can sit these guys out as long as I can hang on for long enough. And that's because of the way we do things. Autocrats can take long-term decisions. Those of us that live under democracy, we have generally sort of fixed-term cycles, much shorter-term thinking. If you look at the discussion around support for Ukraine that took place in the context of the recent midterm elections in the US, look at the discussion around what it might mean if Donald Trump comes back to power. Look at what it's done to the Republican Party. So the discussion about long-term support for Ukraine, you can see why if national leaders do not step up and say we are going to be there for the long haul no matter what, and then back up those promises, you can see why an autocrat might just think, yeah, whatever, I've seen you come, I've seen you go, I can sit this one out as long as I can hang in there for long enough. So these kind of comments from national leaders are very, very, very important, but are only worth it if there is credible, a credible sort of delivery on the promise. So yeah, it'd be good to hear what we think Rishi Sunak's going to say later today, but of course that has to be seen through, and it has to be a cross-party, bipartisan, or across the political spectrum support, so that the autocrats such as Putin look at it and know that this is going to be the position of the UK or of the US or of X, Y, and Z for years to come.
Thanks, Dom. Just on that point about democracy and autocracy, I wonder if, Francis, would you like to go next, actually, because I know you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, obviously, many listeners will be familiar with what's going on in China at the moment. And whilst we mustn't confuse a spark for an explosion, I think it's fair to say that at the present moment in China, in Iran and in Russia, there is considerable internal pressure building up. And at the very least, the instruments of state oppression are being tested in those three countries at the moment, in those three autocracies. Now, it's a common refrain, one often hears said about Russia as well, that the Chinese Communist Party has an unspoken deal with the Chinese people, that in exchange for an economic boom and all sorts of benefits to quality of life, that they can hold on to power, that they have legitimacy. Now, I'd actually question the phrasing of that. I mean, it suggests that this unspoken deal, people have a choice, when I think that if you actually have the mechanisms of state terror in place that are in place in both China and Russia, then I don't think you do really have a free choice. Can you make a free choice if you have a gun to your head? I don't think so. So I would question the terminology that we use. But anyway, don't want to get too bogged down in that. Hopefully we'll get Sophia on to talk about this in more detail this week. But what are the potential implications for Ukraine, what we're seeing in China at the moment? I think broadly speaking, it underlines the point that we've made on this podcast many times, that despite appearances, autocracies are far more fragile than they appear. And when the tide turns, it always turns very quickly. Now, as I say, we mustn't confuse a spark for an explosion. This could be something that is quashed quite quickly, and then we won't be talking about it in a week's time, or it could be something immensely significant. We just don't know, but who knows, it could be the same in Russia one day. So very much worth paying attention to.
Well, thank you, Francis, and thank you, Dom. Roland Oliphant, would you like the very final words?
I think riffing off these points about kind of Western commitment and Western staying power, we've talked a lot on the podcast about the importance of battlefield victories and what that means for that kind of commitment. I've been having some conversations in the past couple of weeks around that. And this is just a little anecdote that I wanted to share, just to illustrate how important that is. So I understand, shortly before the great big breakthrough in Kharkiv, in was it September, there were meetings going on in Washington about, okay, what does victory look like? And the consensus was victories, we're probably in a war of attrition. The best thing the Ukrainians can hope for is to prevent the Russians from moving forward very far, or prevent them from taking any more ground, and slowly degrade the Russians. And that's how we get to some kind of victory. The offensive took place. The conversation turns on a dime. Suddenly people are saying, oh, hold on a second. Maybe the Ukrainians are, maybe we can really win this in a kind of conventional way. Now, that doesn't necessarily reflect, the conversations in the White House, the conversations, in Downing Street, but it's definitely something you pick up on when you speak to officials at various levels in various places in the West. And that brings me to another thing. This notion of Western staying power brings me to the other thing I wanted to say, which was, it's not really about this week. It's about MH17. I was busy reporting it on the day the verdict came out last week, and I was away last week, so I know I'm a bit late to this, and I know you covered it. But that was a really important moment when they convicted 3 people for shooting down the aircraft. They have not ruled out further prosecutions. We all know that where the line of responsibility goes. Now a court has confirmed that it was goes up the line of Russian command, basically. But look, the point with MH17 is, for those of us who were there looking at that field of dead bodies in 2014, thinking, what the hell is going on? How the hell did it get this way? We all thought that this is where it stops. Right, things cannot. The madness has to stop. No one's going to let this carry on. And within a few days, we realised, actually nothing's changing. Actually, the war is carrying on. The West is going to issue some stern words, and it was, in retrospect, just amazing how little it actually changed. As far as I can tell. Maybe, in future years we'll find things in the archive that disabuse me of this notion. But it's very difficult to escape the thought that if the collective West had stood up for the murder of its citizens when that happened in 2014, we wouldn't be here now talking about this absolutely enormous war.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast by The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, do leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there's sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you do want to hear an episode as soon as possible, it's available on your podcast apps. Please search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred app. Check out the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear. And today on Twitter, Emily Hill.